Good morning, everybody. This is Mr. Philippi. Hopefully, my voice doesn't sound too terrible, but as you can probably hear, I'm not feeling 100%. So, I'm going to take today off, but what I'm going to try to do is fill you guys in on where our government originally came from. In order to complete this assignment, you are going to need the 1.4 Road to Rights graphic organizer, and it looks like a really big, scary packet. But you are actually going to finish the entire thing today before you leave, and there won't be any homework. In order to make this work, I have to really trust you guys to be the best that you can be. You are each going to be responsible for trying your best to understand one of the really important founding documents that shaped our government. So, last class, you guys put together a slideshow about the American Revolution. And now today, we find ourselves with the revolution over. We won. We get to be an independent country. But that was actually the easy part. The hard part, if you can imagine, is to ask yourselves, how would you build an entire country with a whole new way of doing a government that's never really been done before from scratch? That's the problem that our founding fathers find themselves in as the American Revolution draws to a close. So for today's lesson, we're going to move through it in 3 parts. Part 1, I'm going to do with you on this video. Part 2 is a group assignment that you will do on your own, and it's very important that you master the document assigned to you, because then in Part 3, we're going to make all new groups where each group has a member of each previous group. So you guys need to be the masters of your own little universe here so that you can really teach one another. For example, how to understand the Declaration of Independence, so on and so forth. So here on the screen, hopefully by now the packets have been distributed and we are going to go ahead and get started. You can see our state standards there that we're going to hit today. And without further ado, we've won the revolution. Now we have to build a country. How does it all go down? The first step happened in the Continental Congresses. Please go ahead and fill out your blanks on the graphic organizer as we go through this together. But as soon as England passed the Intolerable Acts, 12 of the 13 colonies agreed to start meeting together to begin coming up with a game plan about what to do about England. And once they had that framework established, they continued to meet in what is called the Second Continental Congress. And that actually lasted for several years, from May of 75 all the way through 1781. In other words, this group of delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies were actually running the United States before the United States existed. These guys were calling the shots during the war itself. So all the way up through the Battle of Yorktown, it was this group of people that were passing laws to raise taxes for the army and things like that, except as we're about to discover, it wasn't so easy. What they did do is they put our army under the command of General George Washington. I wonder why he sounds familiar. They wrote a thing called the Olive Branch Petition, which is where they tried to strike an agreement for peace with England, where we would have remained English colonies. But as we famously know, the king rejected it. They signed the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July in 1776, and they continued to run the country. So let's talk more about that declaration. It was written and signed on July 4th, 1776, the day that our nation declared its independence from England. There are 2 very important ideas in the Declaration itself that come from the bigger historical movement called the Enlightenment. The first is the idea of natural rights. Natural rights is an Enlightenment philosophy that suggests that human beings, simply because they are human, ought to have certain rights and freedoms that are automatically protected. So when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he included the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He says that is a right that no government can take from a person. Another such Enlightenment idea is the idea of a social contract. The social contract came about from Thomas Hobbes in a well known work called The Leviathan. But the social contract basically says a government can only exist as long as it has the will of the governed, or in other words, you and I. There can be no government that declares itself in charge. Instead, we, the people, agree to put certain limitations on ourselves. For example, we agree that we're not going to murder each other, and we give the government the ability to enforce that. It's a contract. We give up part of our freedom to put power into a government that we expect to take care of us and protect those natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Any government that fails to control their end of the bargain should be done away with because it is the people who have the power, not the government. So, from this declaration through the remainder of the American Revolution, we have to talk about how our country was run. And believe it or not, it was not organized by the US Constitution. Instead, we actually had like a beta version of the US Constitution called the Articles of Confederation. The Second Continental Congress wrote this document, which is really the original Constitution, over a span of 4 years from 1777 to 1781, and it was then ratified by the states. It was a loose alliance of all 13 states. In this arrangement, states themselves actually had more power than the central government. And when I say central government, what I really mean is just Congress. There was no president, there was no judicial branch, there were no court justices, there were no judges, there were no juries, there was just Congress, which means there was just the group of our government that makes new laws. That's it. So here in this little cartoon, you can actually see some of the problems with the Articles of Confederation. There was no president. There were actually no executive agencies, for example, like the Department of Education, that did not exist. There were no courts. They could not collect taxes. They could not raise an army. They could not increase spending for the Navy. Basically, in this original proto version of the United States, states had all the power. They could do whatever they wanted. They were really like 13 independent countries that sort of agreed to work together sometimes. So, as you can imagine, that's not the Constitution we have today. So, what happened? What happened was, in order to pay off the debt of the war, the state of Massachusetts tried to pass a new tax on its people. That tax really, really hurt poor people, but especially farmers. And one particular farmer named Daniel Shays gathered with a local militia, and they pretty much took over their city. It was like a January 6th moment where they were actually able to attack their government buildings, held them all hostage, and because the Articles of Confederation were so weak, our national government had no way to stop this. Massachusetts was basically taken off the playing board, and there was no way to get it back online. These farmers won. There was no army to come in and stop them. So, this event single handedly proved that we are going to actually need to go all the way back to the drawing board and build a whole new constitution. And that's exactly what took place. In one of the hottest summers on record in 1787, the founding fathers met in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, which was our first national capital. They decided they were going to build a government that had three branches. But the first one they wanted to tackle was that Congress, the group that makes laws. When it comes to Congress, who should have the most power? Big states where a lot of people live, or small states because we favor equality and bigger states shouldn't have more power? Well, the first plan that got proposed was called the Virginia Plan. This plan gave more power, more votes to states that had a bigger population. The bigger the state, the more people lived there. Therefore, it deserves to be more important because democracy is power to the people, right? So, a state that has a lot of people ought to have quite a say in how things get done. In other words, the Virginia plan said if a state is large, it would have more representatives in the government. It would get more pieces on the game board. Small states didn't like that. So next, New Jersey proposed a plan. New Jersey said, that's not very equal of you, bro. Favoring big states is not what democracy is all about. We, the little guys, deserve just as much of a voice as the big dogs. And if we have a government that's not equal, then really we're no different than England. We need to fix this right away. So, the New Jersey plan asked for small states to have the exact same amount of power as large states. A great American by the name of Roger Sherman took both plans and was able to work out a compromise that made everybody happy. His compromise worked like this. What we'll do is we'll have both. We will make a Congress that has two houses. In other words, there's a fancy way to say that. You say bicameral. Like bicycle means two wheels. Bicameral means there are two lawmaking bodies in our Congress. One of those is called the House of Representatives, and that is based on the Virginia Plan, where states that have more people living in them have more votes. The other house inside of our Congress is called the Senate. And in the Senate, every single state has the exact same number of senators, regardless of population size. So a state like Kentucky has two senators, such as Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul. A state really big with lots of people like California also has just two senators. But if you walk across the hallway in the Capitol building and you go over to the House of Representatives, California has far more votes than Kentucky, who only has 6 House of Representatives members. Now, since we're going to make part of this based on a state's population, there's an elephant in the room, and that is the issue of the slave population. It is no secret or surprise that the United States had several territories with sometimes hundreds of thousands of slaves held in bondage there. And according to the House of Representatives, where it's based on the number of people there, that's how many votes you get. Well, that actually kind of helps out the slave states, doesn't it? Because if they're able to count slaves for their total number of population, then that means they're actually able to get even more votes for themselves because they're not just going to count their white males. They can count slaves too. And that means, hey, my population just went way up if I count my slaves. So give me more votes. Ultimately, what they decided to do was called the 3/5 Compromise. They decided that out of a state's whole population of slaves, 3/5 of that slave population could be counted up and tacked on top of the state's population. So, who did this benefit? States that had a lot of slaves or states that had very few slaves, typically in the North? The answer is it really benefited slave states, particularly in the South. They were able to use their slaves to get more votes for themselves, and this is going to sort of favor the South in the early years of our country's history because they were able to do this. Keep in mind, though, the slaves themselves were not allowed to vote. The next step, once they've come up with this plan, is to actually get people to agree to it. And this is the hardest step of all. In order to ratify the Constitution, they still had to obey the rules from the Articles of Confederation. Everybody had opinions, but the biggest one across the board was we have to be very careful here. We do not want to end up with a government that can be a tyrant like the King of England. We need to limit the federal government's power. But at the same time, we can't make it too weak, or a bunch of farmers in Massachusetts can shut the whole country down, and that's not good either. So they built the new government on the principle of federalism. Federalism means that power is equally shared or split or divided between the national level, which is where, we have our president, our Congress, our Supreme Court, the state level, which is where right here in Kentucky we have a governor, Andy Beshear, we have a state Senate and a state House of Representatives, so on and so forth, and they make laws just for the state of Kentucky. And then there's also the local level, like here in Louisville, we have Louisville Metro Council, and it's their job to figure out what the buses are doing with JCPS right now. Power should also not all be vested in one spot, because if it is, that particular branch of our government will become all powerful. So the founding fathers wisely divided that power into 3 branches. The 3 branches are called the legislative branch. Those are the law makers. They make the laws. That's Congress, the House, and the Senate. The executive branch, which is the president and all of the executive enforcement agencies. They are the law administrators, or in other words, they are the law doers. They make sure the law is carried out. And there is the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court and all of our court systems. These guys are the interpreters or the judgers of the law. Their job is to make sure the laws actually work and don't violate the Constitution. Now, initially, this new government had a lot of support, but not everybody was on board. There were actually some people who very wisely realized something is missing. So quickly, we sort of split into 2 different viewpoints as a country. There were those called the Federalists who wanted to make sure we had a strong federal government, strong enough that a group of farmers couldn't shut us down. But there was this other group of people, a little bit maybe more conservative, you might say, called the Anti-Federalists. And what they realized pretty quickly was there's not specifically something in the Constitution itself to stop the government from taking power away from individual people. So the Anti-Federalists kind of all went on strike, so to speak, and they all said, we refuse to sign this. We're not going to ratify this. And this new Constitution is never going to happen unless we can add on to the back of it amendments. And the first 10 amendments are going to be called the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights specifically is going to guarantee all of the rights and freedoms for citizens of this country that can never be taken away. Once that was done, the 9th state to ratify it, which by the way, if you care, was New Hampshire, happened in 1788, and the Constitution became the supreme law of the land, and it remains so to this day. The Bill of Rights was ratified unanimously by 1791, and you'll learn exactly what is in the Bill of Rights in the next part of today's lesson. But just kind of a general rule of thumb, the first 8 rights protect your rights and freedoms as a citizen. In other words, because you were born here, you have the right to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, so on and so forth. You have the right to bear arms. You have the right to protect yourself against unlawful search and seizure, so on and so forth. The last 2 rights, number 9 and number 10 on the Bill of Rights, those kind of put a fence around the government, and they basically limit the government only to the specific things that the Constitution says the government can do. Everything else belongs to you and your family, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. It's also important to acknowledge that while all of us can appreciate that this is a whole new method of government that is guaranteeing rights to individuals, which has never happened before ever in human history, and that's really interesting, not everyone got to share in this new equal system of rights. Specifically, Native Americans were completely left out. Slaves were used to benefit the slave states, but they themselves were completely eliminated from voting. And of course, women were not allowed to vote either. So this new constitution was a big step forward in human history. But at the same time, those benefits only existed at first for property owning white men. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. So from here, here's what's going to happen. If Oops. If you have any questions about that, this video will be posted on Canvas for you, and you'll be able to watch it later if you need to. And now what we're going to do is break into our groups for the activities. The next 5 pages of your packet take place in groups. You'll be divided by document, document 1, document 2, 3, 4, and 5, and it will be your job to use your textbook, read the instructions carefully, and then pay attention to the way it's organized. It'll tell you where to find the information, like in Article 1 or Section 2. It tells you exactly where to look on the pages provided. Some of you might need to refer to an online link, which is perfectly fine. When you do so, make sure you scroll down to the document itself. If you're in Blue 1, our substitute teacher can go over your group assignments with you. If you are in Blue 3, here on the screen now, you can see your document assignments. You'll work on these for about 25, maybe 30 minutes until you've really mastered your document. And then what happens is, boop, we go to all new groups that are made up of one member each from the original groups. And it is now your job to teach one another what you learned about the rights and freedoms that our founding fathers wrote for us. And I think that's about perfect timing because I'm starting to lose my voice. So, kiddos, best of luck. Do your best. It is up to you to finish the document portions of this assignment, but the very last page about the importance of the Bill of Rights, we will do together when I am back with you on Wednesday. Adios.